Good morning to you. I want to welcome you to our study of the book of Romans. This is a re-recording of Sunday's class because we had some audio problems and a good bit of it did not get recorded. So I will redo the class without people. So I want you to bear with me on that, but I'm so glad you joined us. In our study, we're going to begin in looking at Romans chapter 3. One of the things I hand out as we start each chapter, we'll have a chapter, and this is chapter 3, the handout we just gave out. It's got a quick breakdown of the outline of the book. At the top, it has terms that are used in the chapter, and we define them biblically so you can know, and then there's a place for notes. And this is always a good thing to have, because as you take your notes on that chapter, then you can set that aside, and when chapter 4 comes available, we'll make the notes for that, and then you can have it, and hopefully as you go through it all, you will have notes for the whole. So that's available to those now. As we said this morning, we'll be in chapter 3. We'll go through it. One of the things that we've seen from the book of Romans is that the theme of the book is found in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, where Paul says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for in it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." There's your theme, the gospel. It's God's power to save people. No other way a person's going to be saved outside that gospel. And so Paul recognizes that this is where God's power is found. When we hit verse 18 of chapter 1, he begins expressing that the wrath of God is against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. Now, the wrath of God is against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. And then the rest of chapter 1, really from 1:18 all the way through 2:16, he gives the guilt of the Gentile world. And that why the Gentile world comes guilty before God and the result of their actions. How God is personally involved in His wrath on them. And then beginning in 2:17, he begins turning to the Jew. And he talks about to the one who bears the name Jew, and they rely on the law. We're talking to them. Always when you study a book, when you study Scripture, always make sure you're dealing with the context of which he's discussing. He's not just talking about us as Christians. He's talking the Gentile world as a whole. He's talking to the Jewish nation or the Jews as a whole. And God's verdict of His wrath being upon all ungodliness and unrighteousness. And the Jews are going to fall under that category, that they too are guilty. Well, in chapter 3, this is going to be the final thrust of an indictment against the Jews. And we'll see that as we go through. He says in chapter 3 in verse 1, "Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the benefit of circumcision?" You see, the Jews had the law. And having the law, there should have been a benefit from that, shouldn't there? And he brings up, and what is the benefit of circumcision? You see, circumcision, that was the seal of the covenant between God and Abraham. And so the Jews circumcised. So he asked the two questions, what has the advantage of the Jew and what's the benefit of circumcision? See, did these give the Jews an advantage? Verse 2, great in every respect. They had a great advantage. They had insight to the things of God that the rest of the world didn't. And so, how does he say great in every respect? What does he mean? Verse 2. First of all, that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. The Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What is, an oracle? An oracle are the Old Testament writings of the law. They were written down. They're not just spoken. They were written. That's what the oracles were. They had this inside track to God written down. Even Stephen in Acts chapter 7 and verse 38, Stephen talks about the oracles of God. These Old Testament scriptures that are written down for them. And so he says, first of all, they were entrusted with the oracles of God. You see that word entrusted? That word carries the idea of two things. One, that it was a responsibility. By being entrusted, they have a responsibility. And two, it's a privilege. And so it's a combination of those things that the Jews being entrusted, they're responsible for the oracles of God, and it's a privilege to have the oracles of God. It did give them an advantage. If anything, the Jews should have known about the teaching of the Messiah. And when the Messiah, Jesus, the Messiah, shows up, and what did the Jews do? They killed Him. They crucified Him, had Him crucified. They had an inside track, and they failed miserably with what had been entrusted to them. Now he begins in verse 3, and in verses 3 through 8, Paul is going to bring this up again in the book of Romans, and he's going to talk about it in detail in Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11. Right now, he just brings up an indictment in 3 through 8 just to make a quick point, and he will come back to it in those chapters. Well, look what he says here in verse 3. What then? If some did not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? If some of the Jews didn't believe what they were entrusted with, if they didn't believe what God said, and God ends up, and the Jews are no longer a part of it, then God must have been unfaithful, right? Their unbelief does not nullify the faithfulness of God. No, it will not do that. And that's the question that he asked. If some did not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God. Continues in verse 4. May it never be. Rather, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. May it never be. God's not unrighteous. That's what He tells them. Just because they were unfaithful does not make God unfaithful. No, let's let God be found true, He says, though every man be found a liar. Man's unbelief, man's lying about things about man and about God, that doesn't change God. He's still going to be faithful. And then he quotes here at the end of verse 4, he quotes from Psalm 51. This is where David has been convicted of sin with Bathsheba. This is where David has deceived. This is where David has murdered. I mean, the horrible things that David did. And he begins this Psalm 51:4. He begins this verse by saying, against you, speaking of God, and you alone have I sinned. And that you are justified when you speak. Here he says you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. That whatever God passes a judgment on the unholiness of man, the unfaithfulness of man, the lying of man, that God is justified when He brings a rightful condemnation, when His wrath is revealed. And David admits it, it's in their writings, and he wants them to know, even David spoke, that God is found true, even though man isn't. Well, knowing that, he goes on into verse 5. But if our unrighteousness, and notice he uses that pronoun our, because Paul is using him as one of the Jews. He says, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Oh, look at the next question in verse 5. The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is He? I'm speaking in human terms. You see, the unrighteousness of man, or the unrighteousness of the Jew, demonstrates that God is righteous. He's righteous all the way, because it shows the Jews that God will keep His word. And this is going to come into greater focus as we get down here into verses 19 and 20. But he says that the God who inflicts wrath, He's not unrighteous. You see, God never promised the blessings upon the unfaithful. Never. God keeps His word. And so He's always kept His word. And at the end of verse 5, he puts in this little statement, I am speaking in human terms. In other words, I'm using a human illustration, using David and any others that are unrighteous, that are unfaithful, that are unbelievers. He's using humans so they can get the point. He continues on. And now, in verse 6, he's going to begin laying out what he meant in verse 5. Let's read verse 5 and go into verse 6 again. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is He? I'm speaking in human terms. Verse 6. May it never be. Emphatic. No, God's not unrighteous. And if He inflicts wrath on the unfaithful and the unrighteous, that doesn't make God unrighteous. It shows that God keeps His word to inflict wrath on people that are unrighteous. He says, may it never be, verse 6, for otherwise, how will God judge the world? You see, if God is unrighteous, then how could God judge the world in His righteousness? He couldn't. If God is unrighteous and He brings about a judgment, His judgment would have to be against His own self. And so the first point that he makes about the God inflicting wrath is not unrighteous. No, because how will God judge the world if He's unrighteous? He's not unrighteous. And He can judge an unrighteous world. Look at the second thing he says about this point that he makes, verse 7. But if through my lie the truth of God abounded to His glory, why am I also still being judged a sinner? It's interesting how he uses the terms. He says, but if through my lie, Paul's speaking about his lie, what would he be talking about? He has addressed what he spoke back in chapter 2 in verse 16, if you'll look right quick, where he talks about on the day when, according to my gospel, God will judge the secrets of men through Christ Jesus. You see, Paul calls it his gospel, the gospel that he taught, the gospel of God that he's not ashamed of. Paul made a personal connection with it. And so using that, his gospel, he comes through here in verse 7, if through my lie. So, you accuse Paul as being a liar? Because what has Paul done through his gospel? He said, but if through my lie the truth of God abounded to His glory. You see, the truth about God was established in that gospel. And guess what it abounded to? His glory. The gospel. Paul said, my gospel that I preach glorified. It illumined God like no other. And so here Paul is talking about, so now you want to talk about that God inflicting wrath is unrighteous? Well, I'll tell you what. If I'm lying, if what I spoke is a lie, then how in the world did it glorify God? Now we have to think about that. We have to deal with that. And so he goes on to say in verse 7 at the end of it, why am I also still being judged as a sinner? Why are people judging me, calling me a sinner, when I spoke my gospel that glorified God in truth? And now you're condemning me. I'm being condemned in this whole thing. What he's doing again, he's showing God's not unrighteous. And the gospel that he preached, that Paul preached, proves it. But if it's not true, how in the world is it upholding the glory of God? He's going to step this out. And the third thing he says in verse 8. And why not say, as we are slanderously reported, and that some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may come. Their condemnation is just. Well, let's just go. If my lie is causing the glory of God, why are you judging me a sinner? And now, why don't we go on and why not go ahead and say, some have slandered Paul. They reported about Paul, and they say that Paul claims that let's do evil so good may come. That was his teaching. Let's do evil so good can come from God. Do you think that man being disobedient, man being unfaithful, the Jews being disobedient to the oracles that they were given, do you think if they're being disobedient that they could do evil and God be glorified through their evil? That's what's being reported. That's what some are saying that Paul is teaching, that let's just do evil so good can come. I mean, let's just do that. It's just completely absurd. And that's why I said their condemnation is just. We don't teach things in this glorious gospel that would condemn and make God a liar. The gospel illuminates God. And so Paul is telling the Jews, you're guilty. You're unfaithful. You being unfaithful, God's faithful to His Word. You're saying that God is unrighteous, then He can't judge the world. You're saying my lie is to the glory of God. Now, how absurd is that? And now you're saying, I'm teaching let's do evil so good can abound. This is all just. Their condemnation is just. Bottom line, Jews, you are guilty. You're guilty in every way. And there's his conclusion in verse 9, if you would look with me, please. What then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. Do having the oracles of God give an advantage? Yes. Did having the oracles of God, he says, makes the Jew better? Are we better off than they? Not at all. Let me define you another term here. You see there in verse 9, that word better? That word better carries the idea of a shield or a protection from something. The Jews who had the oracles of God had an advantage. But that advantage did not shield them, nor did it protect them. They weren't better by having it. It condemned them because they didn't keep it. So see, the real question is, are the Jews sheltered because they had an advantage? And again, he's going to hit this again in verse 19 and 20. We'll be getting to in just a moment. Let me illustrate it this way. Knowing now what the term better means, some of you went to a public university or a public school in some way. Others of you attended a Christian university or a Christian school in some way. Does the Christian school give you an advantage over the public? Well, sure it does. It's under a more controlled environment. The things that are taught, there are things from God that are taught. There is an advantage in it. But does it make you better? Does it shield you? Does it protect you? No. Even though you have an advantage, you still go off into sin. So, it's not better. Let me do it this way. If you and I come to worship, come to assemble together with the saints on the first day of the week, is that an advantage over those who don't? Absolutely, that's an advantage. Does it make you better? Is it a shield to protect you? No. Because you see, you and I can come together for worship, and it can make us worse. Just read 1 Corinthians 11, and it'll tell you that. See, just because you do something in a spiritual sense, just because you have a means to do something spiritually, that doesn't make you better. It doesn't shield you. It doesn't protect you. And so you and I can be in the same boat. And so now he comes down to these charges here in verse 9. What then? Here's the conclusion. Are we Jews better than they, the Gentile? No, not at all. For we've already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all, and get the last two words, really three words, all under sin. All. All are guilty. And so now the indictment is laid out. Well, beginning in verse 10, Paul will begin to use Old Testament Scripture, the Psalms, and he uses different Psalms to go through this, but he'll use the Psalms out of their own Scriptures to prove, look at what he said in these Psalms. Look at verse 10. As it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. Quoting from this Psalms, he's trying to show that he's making a generalization. Let me put it that way. He's making a generalization about the Jews. And so in this generalization, there's none righteous, not even one. Now we do know there were some Jews that were righteous. Not many, but there were some. Jerusalem fell 3 times because the Jewish people had become so corrupt. And God had these ungodly nations overthrow them and take them off into captivity. And so here's your generalization. There's none righteous. There's not even one. You see, he's pointing to the vileness of the Jewish people. Look at verse 11. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. I mean, look at here. Remember, they don't understand. They don't seek. The Jews didn't even do it. Go back, take a little time and read Isaiah chapter 1. And God asked, through Isaiah, asked the Jewish people, who requires you to trample my courts? They're coming offering their sacrifices. They're coming in their festivals. They're coming in prayer. And God says, I've had enough of it all. Your hands are filled with blood. In fact, in Isaiah 1, God calls the people, the Jewish people, and their leaders, Sodom and Gomorrah. There is an indictment. And then he tells them, even though you pray, you spread your hands out in prayer, I'm not going to hear you. There's a righteous judgment of God there. And in the whole process, the prophets are preaching, and you know what they're finding? They're not seeking God. They don't understand. They can't see how vile they become. And so Paul begins to pull these scriptures and saying, this is against you. Look at verse 12. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There's not even one. This is the state of the Jewish nation, the Jewish people. And that in this state, they've turned aside. They've gone after their own things. You see, that starts back up to what he said there in the earlier verses. That in verse 3 there, they didn't believe. And because they didn't believe, God does not promise anything to those who don't believe. And don't you call God unfaithful. Now here they are. They've turned aside. They've become useless. There's no one that does good. Not even one. That's how corrupt. Continue on, verse 13. He said, their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poisons of asps is under their tongues. I mean, here's a quote partially out of Psalm chapter 5. It's another quote out of Psalm chapter 140. And notice he talks about their throat is an open grave. I mean, what a vividness in our minds that would be. Go back and read Psalm 5 and see that. Excuse me. And when he talks about their throat is an open grave, what would you think about looking into an open grave? I mean, you'd see a decaying body. You'd see horrible things. There would be a stench that rises from that. And so there's this picture of the Jews that in their lives, this is what their lives have become. And their tongues, they deceive people. And the poisons of asp, the serpent, is under their tongue. I mean, they destroy everything they talk about. They destroy it all. Earlier in chapter 2, when he talks about the Jew, oh, you're good at talking about God. You're good at talking a lot of things about God, but you don't practice it. You think you're going to escape the judgment of God? And so now, here's this description of who they are. Look at verse 14. Whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths. And the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Look at their life. He speaks about their mouth full of cursing, bitterness. Their feet, the way they live, they go about things. Swift to shed blood. They don't care who they hurt. You know, destruction, misery. They don't have peace. And there's a reason there's no peace in your life. Because, bottom line, there is no fear of God before your eyes. You see, the Jews lost the fear of God. We can too. You lose the fear of God, and you may do a lot of talking about God, but there's no trembling before Him. A few weeks ago, I had an email from a gentleman here in town. And he wanted to know if I thought Revelation was being fulfilled in our present day and time. We began to correspond back and forth. And I showed him that Revelation is fulfilled. It was easy to show from chapter 1 and the last chapter in the book. So I shared that with him. Well, he ended up and he came back and he said, well, I see all of that. Yeah, I can kind of agree. However, I think it's being fulfilled right before our eyes. Well, I wrote him back and I said, if you're really serious that you think that this is the last times of what Revelation speaks of, why aren't you assembling? Why aren't you falling down before God with the assembly of His saints? That would be the fear of the Lord, if you're sincere. Otherwise, are you just wanting information about Revelation and just let it be at that? You see, for the Jew, there's no fear of God for their eyes. And those prophets would come along and they'd tell them, you're wrong. They'd hate the prophets. They wouldn't look at them. They hated Jesus. And so now, hear this one big sweeping indictment. Jews, you're guilty. You're guilty, and God has been found faithful. And so now, as we get to all of this, look at verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be closed and all the world may become accountable to God. The law speaks to those who are under the law. And what does the law do? The law makes all accountable, all the world accountable before God. Because you see, they were law breakers. And a law breaker makes you accountable. It's kind of like James chapter 2, verse 10. He says, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point has become guilty of it all. Yeah. You see, the law required perfection. And if you broke any law, any commandment, you're guilty of the whole. Let me throw one side note in about this. That's why we're not under the Ten Commandments today. If you decide you want to follow the Ten Commandments and keep those, some of those Ten Commandments aren't even in effect today. But if you fail in any of them, in one of them, you're guilty of the whole law. You want to be under that? The Jews were. The Jews were condemned. And the law made every man accountable to God, everyone. Why? Verse 20. Because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in His sight. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. By the works of the law, by doing the works, no one, no flesh can be justified. Justified, that's one of the words at the top of your outline. It means to be acquitted of all charges. You know what the law could not do? The law could not acquit you. It could only tell you you're sinful. It's what gave you the knowledge of sin. And that's what the law did to the Jew. It gave them knowledge that they were lawbreakers. It did not provide a way out. Paul told the Galatians in Galatians chapter 3 in verse 10, he says, "For that as many as are under the works of the law," or of the works of the law, "For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law to perform them." If you don't abide by all the things written, you come under a curse. So now, no one can be acquitted, justified, going to the law. And Jews, that means you. The charges have been laid out. Jews, even though they had an advantage, are not better. No. If you're a Jew under the law, relying on the name Jew, you are accountable to God. If you're a Gentile, you too have gone astray. And God's wrath is against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. So that makes all mankind in need of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's why Paul starts his book, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for in it is God's power to save you." And that's where he's headed to show. But until people come to understanding that they're guilty, the gospel won't be as beautiful for you and me. Okay, we will end there. Next week, Carrie will be back to teach the class. And I hope you join that in the study as we continue and finish out chapter 3. God's blessings to you all.